Hello, and welcome to Apollo 13, a successful failure, brought to you by the North Olympic Library System. Tonight's program includes a presentation by Logan Jaeren, founder of STEAM for Space, a nonprofit organization that partners with educators around the world to spark curiosity among students about space and space exploration. Following Logan's presentation, former NASA Apollo astronaut Fred Haise will join the program for the question and answer portion of the evening. I have one technical note to share before I hand things off to Logan. Logan's presentation includes some incredible video and audio clips, some of which might play at a slightly reduced volume. So I just want you all to be prepared to hit your volume on your device if you need to. There may just be certain portions where you'll want to increase that volume just a touch. So be prepared to adjust the volume on your device if you find it difficult to hear any portion. So now I'm very excited to turn the floor over to Logan Jaeren. Thank you, Logan, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Karina. I appreciate the opportunity to and the invitation to present to your patrons and on the Olympic North Olympic Peninsula. I am actually a resident of Port Orchard, so I am not that far away from you all. Um, so tonight's presentation is a part of a program that actually Fred and I collaborate on, and we do this for educators. But this is actually great to be able to share an experience with you about Apollo 13 and to create the opportunity for you to have some Q&A time with Fred. So just to give a quick background, I am a space patch collector and curator of stories about their design. Through my own research and an investment in understanding mission patches, I created STEAM for Space to be able to get real mission patches into the hands of students through educators around the world. And currently, I've donated over 46,000 patches to 1,000 educators in 25 countries, and it's growing. And that's only been in the last 2 years. So it's wonderful. And so Fred and I actually collaborate on sharing with you the story of his mission and giving you the opportunity to learn more about his mission, but also the opportunity to think about, maybe things that you're curious about. So with that, I'm going to do a presentation to kind of walk you through Fred's career. We're going to watch a 30-minute NASA produced video that is a wonderful documentary it's available on YouTube, but it's actually one of the best documentaries that really give you an idea about the mission from the standpoint of the crew who were in their mid 30s. And with that documentary, you also will hear and see the interviews with the crew members and members of Mission Control in their mid 80s. So there we get essentially a before and after scene before we actually introduce Fred for you to cue your questions. So with that, just give me a minute to share. With all the optimization and sound sharing in place. Okay, here we are. So Apollo 13 is often considered to be a successful failure um, for um, for lots of different reasons. It was a failure in the fact that the mission to land on the moon didn't succeed, but it was a success in the fact that uh, the contribution of over 5,000 people here back on Earth worked together to be able to bring the crew safely home. And so, with that, it certainly was a success in terms of bringing the crew safely back to Earth. So Fred Haise has a really interesting career path. So he graduated early from high school at the age of 16 to start with. He enrolled at the University of Oklahoma and earned his Bachelor of Science degree in aeronautical engineering because he wanted to become a test pilot, and test pilots had to have an engineering degree. And at the same age of 24, he became a NASA research test pilot. And with that entrance into NASA, he flew with the likes of Chuck Yeager and other folks who were essentially flying experimental aircraft. And that's what Fred's passion was flying. So it got to the place where Fred, recognizing that some of the experimental programs were coming to an end, he was looking for how he could fly higher and faster. So he joined NASA's astronaut corps at the age of 32, and 4 years later, he was flying to the moon. Now, following his career in NASA, he continued to work with NASA, but in a different capacity. He became the commander of the very first space shuttle orbiter called Enterprise. And then following his retirement from NASA, he became an executive for the Grumman Corporation, which provided services to the space shuttle. Following his retirement, he established the Infinity Science Center, which is in southern Mississippi near the Louisiana border. Published his book Never Panic Early in 2022, and then was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame. And today he is a resident of Houston, one of the few Apollo era folks who still lives in Houston with his best friend Tito. So Fred's career really started off as a test pilot. He logged over 9,000 flight hours with 6,000 hours of flying jets. And then with his acceptance into the astronaut corps, he trained for quite a few years before flying on Apollo 13. Later to return as a test pilot and as an engineer to help develop and refine the designs of the space shuttle and designing the avionics and flight systems for the shuttle. Now, as a member of three crew members for Apollo 13, by this time, Apollo 11 had occurred, Apollo 12 had occurred. And so with Apollo 13, there was this kind of notion and almost complacency that, okay, we've done this twice, it's becoming routine. Apollo 13, like any other mission to the moon at this point, was considered to be somewhat routine. What wasn't routine was 2.5 days before launch, Ken Mattingly, who was the command module pilot, was replaced with his backup, Jack Swigert, 2.5 days before launch. For some teams, that would be incredibly disruptive, but the backup crews and the prime crews trained together, and they had the same amount of training. They could have swapped the entire crew, and it would have been a success. So the mission launched on schedule, April 11th at 13:13 Central Time in Houston, Texas, to begin their journey to the moon. Approximately on April 13th, at 55 hours, 54 minutes, and 53 seconds, there was an explosion. The oxygen tank that exploded had the force of 7 tons of dynamite. And because the explosion occurred in space, the vacuum of space, the crew survived. If this explosion had occurred on Earth, the crew would not have survived. But because it happened in the vacuum of space, they did survive. And from that moment forward, over the course of the next days, approximately 5,000 people were involved in helping to bring this crew home. And so many more people than I think, than the film Apollo 13 would portray. So clearly, failure was not an option in this case. They had to bring the crew home. When Fred was accepted as an astronaut into NASA, he was a backup crew member for Apollo 8. So, and following that, because he didn't fly in that mission, the prime crew did, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and Bill Anders, he became the backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 11. He was Buzz Aldrin's backup. And so he was there in case Buzz Aldrin couldn't fly. He would have actually been the second person to walk on the moon. But we know that didn't happen. And now here we are with Apollo 13. This was Fred's chance as lunar module pilot for this mission to essentially be the 6th person to walk on the moon. So the original crew, portrayed here with James Lovell on the left, Ken Mattingly in the middle, and Fred Haise. Because of this change in the crews, the official photos were taken without the crew being in their spacesuits. They were actually in civilian clothes because things were, they had to take photos like within 2.5 days of launch, updated the photos. But I want to bring your attention to the emblem that you see in front of Ken Mattingly in the middle. That emblem was actually inspired by a mural that was 20 feet wide, 8 feet tall. It hung in the lobby of the St. Regis Hotel in New York. And in 1969, the crew of Apollo 13 met up in the lobby of this hotel, and Jim Lovell took great notice of this huge mural of these horses. It turns out the name of this mural is the Steeds of Apollo. There is a wonderful coincidence. James Lovell was a type of astronaut who was very involved in the design of his mission patch. And so this mural really inspired him. And he wanted to do something very different in terms of the emblem for this mission compared to other missions. So he was thinking about this, and he actually wanted to do something with Greek mythology. So there was this image of Apollo driving a three-horse chariot dragging the sun across the sky. And that was what was the inspiration for the design. They commissioned Lumen Winter, who was the artist for the mural, to create the emblem for their mission. And Lumen actually created a relief. He actually sculpted the emblem and presented that to the crew for approval. As with all emblems that are created for all missions, it eventually gets into the hands of an artist, and that artist makes a refined graphic art of the emblem design. Norman Tiller was that artist for this mission. And he did something unusual. In the leg of the horse, he actually put his initials, Norman Tiller, NT, on the leg of the horse. So you still see that if you see the official graphic design, you'll see that NT still there. So that's what we end up. We end up with the official emblem for Apollo 13. Now, as I mentioned, the launch of Apollo 13 took place on 1313 Central Time, April 11th. The service module exploded on the 13th. The command module was named Odyssey, and what was not really known at that time was Odyssey stands for a long journey full of adventures, and that certainly was what Apollo 13 was about. So the Odyssey is the spacecraft where the crew traveling to space sit. It's at the very top of the Saturn V rocket, and this is where Fred was sitting. Quick model just kind of give you some sense for the lunar module and the service module and command module. Together, this comprises the Apollo spacecraft. The lunar module is what actually detaches from the command module to go to the moon. One of the things I've taken note is the scale. The lunar module is actually really big. It's 26 feet tall. So you can see these are pictures taken of Apollo 12's lunar module, lunar landing. Inside the lunar module, which is the spacecraft that Fred trained to fly, there are no places to sit because it's in 1/6 gravity. You wouldn't be sitting anywhere. So there's no chairs. There's no place to sit. You're standing or laying down or attached to the floor or to a wall so you don't drift around. And here's a quick view of the console on the right-hand side. So lots of switches, a lot of manual and analog switches that are involved. In the center, you see a dark keypad. That's actually the computer. And the computer is actually, I would say it is your modern iPhone today is 100,000 times more capable and powerful than the computer that made it possible to land on the moon. So there's a hatch, there's a doorway in the towards the bottom on the floor, and that's actually where the astronauts exit to conduct their EVA, their moonwalk. A quick view of the trajectory from to the moon and back to the Earth. And at this spot, there were 200,000 miles from Earth is when the accident occurred. Now, what is actually miraculous is this was the perfect place to have this type of accident. If it happened earlier, they wouldn't have had enough power. They wouldn't have had enough, they wouldn't have enough power and water to sustain them to get back to Earth. If it happened later, even after they detached to go to the moon and descend to the moon, if that had happened, they wouldn't have survived either. They wouldn't have had enough fuel. They wouldn't have had enough power to be able to get back to Earth. It happened at the best time that this type of accident could have happened. And this was an accident that could not have been trained to prepare for because it was unthinkable. Accidents of this type, they would never expect the crew to survive. So this was not there was no contingency for the accident that did occur. So on the way back to the moon, Once they set a course, they actually drifted for almost 70 hours. So it takes about 75 hours to travel from the Earth to the Moon and back. Coming closer to the Earth, the spacecraft essentially, the service module detaches. And this was the first time they got the crew had put their eyes on the service module to look at the damage. And then the lunar module detaches. And then they come back into the Earth's atmosphere. Now, in this photograph, you see Fred Haise is sitting on the left on the edge of the raft. Jack Swigert is actually in front of him, and James Lovell is off to the right behind the diver. It turns out that the divers that help with rescuing and recovering the crew are part of the underwater demolition team. This is the team of naval people who are involved in the Navy who perform underwater demolition. That is the same team of people that actually train the astronauts for water rescue. And it's the same team that actually works to recover the crew once they've splashed down. So this is a well-known photograph. Clearly, this mission had a happy ending, so it was successful in that regard. There's a mock-up of this, of the crew in this pose. There's a mock-up of this at Space Center Houston. It's on display. Clearly, people were elated. But following this mission, almost without much time that passed, Fred got assigned to be the backup commander for Apollo 16. So his career continued. And then when he didn't fly that mission, he was actually slated to be the commander for Apollo 19. But that was a mission that was canceled about 4 months after Apollo 13. So Fred's career is actually quite broad. It involves both 5 missions in Apollo. It involved a space shuttle program, the approach and landing test for the shuttle. And there was actually this really interesting mission called STS-2A. This was actually a space shuttle mission that was designed to go back to Skylab to rescue Skylab, which is America's first space station. Its orbit was declining. It was expected to be salvaged and boosted, its orbit to be boosted by the space shuttle, but the space shuttle incurred lots of delays. And Fred and Jack Lausma actually trained to go back to the Skylab to be able to boost its orbit so it can continue to be used. But the shuttle wasn't ready. The delays basically cost the life of the Skylab, and it re-entered and burned up in Earth's atmosphere. Some parts of it landed in Australia, much to the dismay of the citizenry there. Fred went on to actually be an executive to work on Space Station Freedom, which was the which predated the International Space Station. So NASA was working on creating an American space station. So in short, Apollo 13 is actually an excellent documentary that really showcases the mission itself. It stays really quite true to the story. There is some dramatic license that is taken, and but it's been asked before, but it's worthy of asking, definitely worthy of asking Fred, what are some of the differences between the film and the movie? He'd be happy to share that. With that, I'm going to skip ahead and start the video. This is a 30-minute long video that will showcase, essentially tell the story of the mission and help you understand us in the details, help you learn something new, but also prepare you for the questions you may want to ask Fred yourself. So.
This little tape recorder has been a big benefit to us in passing some of the time away in our transit out to the moon.
Should be hearing music and along with seeing the text on the screen.
This is the crew of Apollo 13, wishing everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night.
It was plagued by bad omens and bad luck from the very beginning.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
It never really converged to the point where you felt you really had total control of what was going on.
Okay, stand by.
About the time you'd turn the corner, something new'd show up.
Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here.
By the time we came on duty, we were well aware that we had a big problem on our hands.
Can say again, please?
It was life-threatening.
Houston, we've had a problem.
It was not about landing on the moon in the right place. It was about survival.
Main beam bus undervolt.
Stand by, 13, we're looking at it.
Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
This is Mission Control Houston. We appear to have a good first stage at this point.
Here we go.
Okay, Fada.
We're go, flight. Looks good here.
Guys,
Looks good, flight.
Okay, Econ, GNC.
Looks good, flight. Looks good, flight.
Okay, Sergeant.
Looks fine.
The crew was Jim Lovell was the commander. Jack Schweigert was the command module pilot. Jim I had worked with as a backup crew on Apollo 8. When he flew Apollo 8, I was the backup lunar module pilot on that mission. And then we worked, obviously, as a backup crew for Apollo 11. I backed up Buzz Aldrin on that mission. Jack Schweigert, because of a measles threat, replaced Ken Mattingly 2.5 days before launch. So that was something that never happened before or since, I don't think, on a mission.
Flight Dynamics Officer says the trajectory looks good. We show a 1/2 mile in altitude at this time.
We had 4 teams in mission control. We did this from a standpoint of easing the shifting schedule, being able to train for very specialized events during the course of the mission. And then one of us always designated as sort of a lead. And basically the objective of the lead was to address any crises that come up to get your team off the console, and the remaining 3 teams would continue 24/7 support for the mission, as well as picking up a lot of the actions related to the getting the crew back home. I happened to be on console at that time, and we're just right at the very end of our shift. We're preparing for crew sleep period. And one of the last things you do is take a look at the cryogenics and see if you need to stir them up, make them uniform. So you got equalized pressures going into life support system, the fuel cells.
We've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks. In addition, I have a shaft and trunnion.
Okay.
For a look at the Comet Bennett if you need it.
Stand by. Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Can say again, please?
Houston, we've had a problem.
Glenn was coming on with his team at that time, reading the log, preparing for handover.
By the time we got to handover, we knew full well that we had to take care of this thing in terms of an emergency. We were handling something that we knew was out of control. And in this case, every team that came on was dealing with a major set of problems.
I assume you've called in your backup ECOMs?
Flight, say again?
Have you called in your backup ECOMs now? See if we can get some more brain power in this
We
thing?
got one here.
Roger.
We had this loud bang, which kind of reverberated with a little echo, because the vehicles we're in were metal vehicles, and it was kind of like you're in a big barrel and they hit on the side with a sledgehammer kind of sound. In the tunnel area, some of the metal was actually crinkling, kind of like you take a Coke can and squeeze it, a little crinkling. So the 2 vehicles were moving not together, but a little asymmetric, I think, in roll, and that was causing that stress in the tunnel area.
I went down into the command module and saw that we had lost 2 of our 3 fuel cells, that they develop oxygen. I then looked out the window and saw escaping at a high rate of speed, a gaseous oxygen. And it turned out that that oxygen that I was examining was from the second tank, because the explosion occurred on the damaged tank, but that also ruptured the second tank. The first tank just blew the entire side of the spacecraft off.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction that could cause the lunar landing mission to be terminated early.
At the moment, the astronauts are continuing to try to isolate their trouble. A late report says the spacecraft now is operating on battery power alone. All unnecessary equipment is being turned off.
Oh, within a couple of minutes when I got to my position, from looking at the instrument panel, 2 meters had the needles on oxygen tank 2 in the bottom, and they were fed by different sensors, which are unlikely to fail at the same time. So I knew we lost tank 2. Without looking at mission rules, I knew that was an abort.
Here in mission control, we're now looking towards an alternate mission, swinging around the moon and using the lunar module power systems.
Although we spent lots and lots of time thinking through all the mission rules, when it really happens, like in this case, we didn't have to open any books to tell us what we had to deal with.
Tell me you from flight. Go ahead, flight. I want you to get some guys figuring out minimum power in the LEM to sustain life.
Since the cryo-oxygen tank blew up, it ruptured the other lines. And we lost all oxygen supply to the fuel cells and the crew module. And the crew module was dying real quickly from lack of power other than the battery, and we didn't want to use the battery because we needed that for entry.
This is Apollo Control at 57 hours 46 minutes ground elapsed time. The black team of flight controllers is now on station in Mission Control Center looking at possible alternate missions, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak in the cryogenic oxygen in the service module. And now in the process of powering down the command module. Less than 15 minutes remaining of electrical power to the CSM.
The biggest things we had to do in the dying moments of the electrical system in the command module was to transfer the guidance system from the command module to the lunar module. And we only had about 15 minutes to do that, because if we didn't get the guidance system in the lunar module, that meant that we'd have to start all over again to try to get the lunar module guidance system up to speed.
This scheme of going across to the lunar module, still connected with the open tunnel, the lunar module would serve as a sort of lifeboat for the crew of Apollo 13.
And then we started turning on all things, the control systems. We were starting to talk out from the lunar module. And in fact, we were in the lunar module before the ground realized it, and suddenly realized that, oh, they're over there. And then, of course, what they had to say is, we're going to have to get you off the course you're in now to get you back on the free return course.
And this meant that we were no longer on a path that would allow us to be swung around the moon and come back towards the landing spot on the Earth. The controllability of the spacecraft was okay as long as we had our indicators up, because we had practiced that, as I had said. But suddenly, to save power, we shut that down for a while, and we had to control it by only looking at our computer display. And I had never tried that before. I really don't know who had, and it's a very difficult task. And we spent a lot of our first part of our emergency or survival time just learning how to control the spacecraft in this mode.
The parasynthion near the moon, they would use the descent propulsion system of the lunar module.
for trans-earth injection burn at about 79 hours 30 minutes ground elapsed time. This would produce a day early entry at about 142 hours. That is a day earlier than a nominal free return entry. We're continuing to monitor the situation and still live on air ground.
No, I think to me the loss of comm was business as usual. Every mission, as you went around the backside of the moon, you had LOS and then AOS, and I didn't have any reason to figure we wouldn't be back in the communication when we came out the other side. I spent a good part of the time with Jack Schweigert primarily. Jim wasn't that interested. He'd been to the moon and seen it. We shot a lot of pictures. We had 2 cameras out, and we were shooting pictures like crazy, like tourists.
We are about 70 hours from home, and we think we have the situation in control. We've projected the consumables as I've described, and we have a plan for carrying out the rest of the mission, but there's going to be no relaxation at all as far as that goes from now until splash.
Our first maneuver was to get us back on free return. The second one was to get us home early. The nominal flight time back home was 155 hours if we had done nothing else. But because consumables were critical, and the ground was calculating consumables, and Fred was also doing the back of the envelope type calculation, which he figured if we were lucky we had about 1 hour spare consumables left before we had landed. We had decided, or the ground had decided, to burn at about 2 hours past the moon, at about 79 hours, a maneuver to shorten the time to get home again.
Plus X, Raj. We have ignition, Raj.
13%. Ground confirms ignition.
40%. Raj, 40%.
Houston copies.
Is it stable control? Looks good now, fine. Raj.
Attitude looks good at this point.
Roger. FTP. Roger, FTP. Still stable?
After that, the ground was very much concerned with power, and we were too. Command module just slowly kept going down in temperature until I think just prior to reentry, it was down to about 38 degrees. And along with that, it was a sort of a chilling coldness. The walls were perspiring, the windows were completely wet, and it wasn't too healthy. I recall that we went in there to get some hot dogs one day, and it was like reaching into the freezer for the food.
One of the potable water lines was frozen the morning of entry on the last day. That's how cold it was in there, without active thermal control.
Of course, as the temperature went down, we became concerned about keeping warm, and Fred and I broke out our lunar boots, which we had stowed away in the lunar module, and Jack looked at his wet feet a couple times. But he had an extra set of underwear, so he put that on. We actually had a third little sleep restraint, which Fred then put on and buttoned up and kept a little bit warm.
The command module was very wet. The water separators weren't working, either in the LEM or the command module, and there was water everywhere. In the LEM, there's no inner walls, so you could see water on all the connectors, wire bundles, plumbing, every turn, a glob of water. And the command module, we actually had to get towels out to wipe off the instrument panel to see the instruments.
The carbon dioxide canister was filling up quite rapidly, and we had to figure out a way of using the canisters in the command module and place them in the lunar module systems.
And the ground read us up a procedure in order to adapt some of the command module canisters for use in the LEM. And as they read this thing up, Jim and I constructed one of these things. At this point in time, I think the partial pressure of carbon dioxide was reading about 15 millimeters. And we constructed two of these things and put them online, and I think within an hour, the partial pressure of CO2 was down to 2/10. So these were very effective devices.
About the time that we had the lithium hydroxide canisters in place running on the line, my team came in from the rest period. And trajectory team came up. Jerry Bostic was running that. Basically said, I don't know what's going on, but our trajectory's shallowing out. We had to figure out how to perform maneuver without a computer display system, and this was one procedure that they developed, I believe, for Apollo 8.
The ground, after some tracking, realized that we were not on a trajectory that would get us safely back home, and that we'd have to make another maneuver.
We're making the burn, and I'll give you a hack here at 2 minutes to go.
By this time, the crew stations became a lot different. There are 3 people in the lunar module now, usually built for 2. This last maneuver was going to be unique because we did not have the platform powered up, so we didn't have a normal method of determining the attitude of the spacecraft in order to perform the burn.
Right here, 2 minutes, we got it.
On Apollo 8, some time ago, we were concerned with perhaps losing a platform on the return voyage home, and since no one had ever made a lunar trip before, we were looking at sort of way out ways of determining how we could make these corrections home. And some of our people here at MSC had come up with an idea about using the terminator of the Earth to orient the spacecraft, and then the sun position to get orientation and pitch. And with that knowledge, we could then make corrections to correct our angle of entry into the atmosphere.
And mark it, 1 minute.
And as you know, I think that the angle of entry into the atmosphere is a very small angle, only about 2 degrees, and so it has to be controlled very closely, and that's what the main tracking is for. So at 105 hours, they gave us instructions to relight the descent engine, to orient the spacecraft in this manner, and give this particular procedure a try. And when they read up the procedure to us, I just couldn't believe it, because even on Apollo 8, I thought I'd never in all the world have to use something way out as this.
Engine arm to descent.
And because it was a manual burn, we had a 3-man operation. Jack would take care of the time. He'd tell us when to light off the engine, when to stop it. Fred handled the pitch maneuver, I handled the roll maneuver, and I pushed the buttons to start and stop the engines.
Ignition. Thrust looks good. Shut down. 470. Okay, looks good. Nice work. Let's hope it was.
Everything got stacked up to the end. We had a dead mothership. Another big challenge for the ground was to build the procedure in about 3.5 days, how to power it up. We had no procedure to power it up. It had never intended to be ever shut down. And that was a pretty monumental task for a lot of people on the ground.
We've run these simulators both here and at the Cape and at the contractors that continuously ever since last night. We've tried to simulate virtually everything that we've had the crew to do that is non-normal that they've done. And we've proven most everything that we've been able to run on the simulator prior to passing it up to them. There may be some details we haven't done, but at least we've checked the feasibility of everything we've done, and we'll continue to do that.
We really threw away the book. We had never powered down a command module in space, and we had never reactivated one.
And Jack wisely said, well, the first thing was to push in all the circuit breakers with panels on each side. And he said, let's punch in, we'll time it, we'll punch in 6 and stop and see if we smell burning wire, which you can tell when wire's burning. And then we'll step ahead and do the next 6. So we went through the initial activation that way, knowing things were wet. Now, we were, I think, saved in a second-hand way by the Apollo 1 fire, because they rewired totally both vehicles, so everything was virtually waterproof.
Normally when you come home, you have only the command and service module. So the only thing we have to get rid of is this service module just prior to entering the atmosphere. Coming home now, though, we had a dead service module. We had a command module that had no power to it. We had a lunar module that was a wonderful vehicle to travel home with, but didn't have a heat shield, unfortunately, and shortly we'd have to abandon her.
And Jim and Fred were in the LEM and using the translation controller to give us some velocity, and when Jim yelled fire, I jettisoned the service module. And it went off amidst a lot of debris, which is usual, and Jim began to pitch around to try and photograph it.
We copied that report from Jim Lovell of service module separation at 138 hours, 2 minutes, 8 seconds.
I finally caught sight of the service module as it tumbled around in view. And it was, to me, sort of an amazing sight.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing.
Is that right?
I didn't realize that this whole panel by the high gain antenna was blown clean off right along the area where the panel normally swings open. I could see the interior. I couldn't see exactly what was damaged. I could see material hanging out from the interior.
Right by the high gain antenna, the whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine.
Copy that. It's really a mess.
So now we have the command module and the lunar module together, which is an unusual combination. We've never flown this before.
Then a little later, with an offset angle, we blew off the LEM, basically. We had to pressurize the tunnel and blow it off to get the separation kick of the LEM. And again, that was done very late.
We couldn't jettison that until we knew for sure that the command module was in the proper place, the proper time, and the proper angle. If we came in less, we'd skip out like skipping a stone on water. If we came too high, we'd burn up just like a meteor in the atmosphere.
We're up now on 3 minutes until time of drogue deployment. Standing by for any reports. Acquisition. Got a report that a Raya 4 aircraft has acquisition of signal. Odyssey, Houston, standing by, over. Okay, we read you, Jack. That was command module pilot Jack Schwager. We're looking at the weather on TV and it looks just as advertised, real good. It's been 2 minutes now from time of drogue deployment. A report of 2 good drogues coming up now for main chutes.
Odyssey, Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Extremely loud applause for Apollo 13. No
recall, Captain, that when I spoke to you on the phone, you said that you regretted that you were unable to complete your mission. I hereby declare that this was a successful mission. From the start, the exploration of space has been hazardous adventure. The voyage of Apollo 13 dramatized its risks. The men of Apollo 13, by their poise and skill under the most intense kind of pressure, epitomized the character that accepts danger and surmounts it.
Once we were into entry, which was incidentally done fully automated, it was pretty much the normal entry all the way down, and all 3 chutes came out. And kind of miraculously, since we had abused the vehicle, the mothership, by freezing it for 4 days, the water tanks were frozen when they recovered it on board the ship. So we exceeded specifications on all the avionics, certainly. It gave us the second most accurate splashdown of the program. So it was a question of getting this entire world geared and oriented to one single job: get the crew home. And boy, the teams worked out great.
And it didn't need coaching. It just happened. And we all knew each other. We all were comfortable with who could do what and so on. So there you are. We pulled that off.
Actually, I guess when the parachutes came out and they blossomed and we landed on the water and didn't sink, I think we were home safe.
Well, of course, when we hit the water, we were very happy to be back home, and we commented on that fact. The recovery of 13 was almost textbook recovery. It was a calm day. The actual splashdown itself was very mild, and the Navy did a grand job.
If anything, has increased my confidence in the ability of this nation's space program to take an unusual situation and react to it and come out with a successful conclusion. I consider recovery of the crew a successful conclusion. But I have nothing but the utmost admiration for the people on the ground who work tireless hours to get us back.
Sometime this year, I'll have had 15 years with NASA, and I don't figure I'll retire for another 30 maybe. So I'll just do whatever job the agency decides is the best place I can be and to contribute the most.
Well, thank you for indulging in a recap of the Apollo 13 mission. With that, I would like to introduce Mr. Fred Haise. Hello, Fred.
Good evening.
So we are here in Washington State with the North Olympic Library System, and we have some people that would like to ask you some questions after they've watched the NASA video of your mission. By the way, that video was actually recorded in 2017. So it wasn't that long ago. So what I'll ask people, if we got some questions coming in for you. So one of the first questions coming in is, how far away from the moon were you when the accident occurred?
I can't tell you. I think the expression I've always heard is we were 9/10 of the way to the moon.
Right.
So we had one, I have no idea what it was in miles or kilometers.
So I think it was around 40, between 40 and 42,000 miles. So if you count the near side of the moon versus the far side. So one question is, it's amazing that this year marks the 30 years since the release of the film Apollo 13, directed by Ron Howard. Fred, what do you think about the film? What was depicted well and what was not?
Well, I think overall the movie did a very good job of describing the situation, the problem, and did carry the theme very well of the teamwork between ourselves, having to do things unusually that were figured out, frankly, by people on Earth. And of course, they highlighted Gene Kranz and the white team in Mission Control as the primary people on Earth that we worked with. The actual team we worked with on Earth was much larger. In fact, every Apollo flight had 4 teams with 4 flight directors. Gene was the white team. There were 3 other flight directors, 3 other teams. And for some of the problems, they actually worked beyond Mission Control through the MIR, Mission Evaluation Room, which was in a building next door to Mission Control, which was Building 30 at Johnson Space Center. And Building 45 was the MIR, and there was the program office people, Max Fauche's NASA engineering people, and dedicated people from all the major contractors. And that in those days, that would be North American Aviation in California and Grumman Corporation in New York, to call upon the people there as needed to work some of these problems or consult on some of these problems, because the manufacturers actually designed and manufactured the vehicles, tested them, and readied them to be signed off for NASA for delivery to NASA at Kennedy Space Center to then be launched. So the real engineering brain trust that had developed those vehicles was at the contractors. So I don't have any idea how many people were consulted, but I'm guessing it was probably several thousand.
Yeah.
At one time or another during that flight. I complained to Ron Howard that he did not show more people that had taken part. His quick answer was, well, when you only have 2 hours or a little more, I think this movie ended up being, 2:30. He said, really, an action movie, you should never have more than about 2 hours and 15 minutes. He said, but anyway, in that time, you only have so much time to develop characters. So I was just limited, and I happened to pick Gene Kranz as most colorful flight director to choose, and his white team to highlight in the movie.
Yeah.
The other complaints I had to him was the drama. In some respects, greatly exaggerated my space sickness with a big vomit. Bill Paxton did. They had Jack Schweiger and I having some argument about who threw the switch. Jim and I wasn't even in a capsule at the time. If I had been, I'd have been in the right couch, and that switch was right in front of me, so I would have thrown the switch. So it didn't matter who threw the switch. There was no way of knowing there was going to be an electric short.
Yeah.
So he had the vehicles looking like they were going out of control when we were doing the manual without a computer maneuvers, 2 of them on the way home, all manually, doing our alignment out the window to get the attitude right, and then firing the engines as appropriate. And he exaggerated that. We actually didn't move more than a couple of degrees in any axis. The maneuvers are very short. I think one 20-something seconds and the other 18-something seconds. So we couldn't have strayed very far even if we had not touched anything. But at any rate, that was done. He had Jim Lovell hugging me at one point in the movie because I did get cold and I had chills and fever. And that probably wasn't a bad idea, but it didn't happen. So those kind of things he added in to make us, in his mind, he had listened to all the air-to-ground radio calls, the Capcom and Mission Control to us for the whole mission. And he told me after I finished listening to all that, he said, it never sounded like you had a problem. So he did some of that to humanize us, it was his description. He was humanize us with some of that drama.
Well, I would assume that that has a lot to do with all of the training that you and your crewmates have had over the years, both as test pilots as well as training for these missions that held you true on the problem. What was like a big lesson that you learned from the mission? Was there a big lesson or takeaway from the mission?
No, I don't think there was. Obviously the problem was actually caused before the flight by I don't remember how long it was, but we did the wet countdown. This is where in those days we filled up the rocket and everything else and went through the launch procedure to within seconds of launch and called it all off, and then they had to detank everything. They had to get all the propellant out, oxygen and LOX out of the tanks in the spacecraft. And one tank couldn't readily be detanked. I couldn't get the oxygen out. So they did a rig to use the spacecraft heaters, which they knew had enough lifetime to go fly the flight. And they were using the heaters internally in the tank to get that oxygen out on tank 2. They had a technician there monitoring a meter. The spacecraft wasn't hot to monitor meters in the spacecraft. And he had a meter to watch temperature, pressure. And unfortunately, the meters they chose to monitor pegged out before it got to the dangerous point. So the poor technician thought everything was great. And so it ended up overheating and overpressurizing the tank a little bit. And that caused, I'm sure, some degradation of the insulation on wiring that set us up for then with the launch and launch vibration to then get to where we were stirring the cryos with a little egg beater in the tank that caused the electric shock. But no, otherwise, I don't think there was any big other lesson. The system we had to work problems was utilized on every flight. Every flight had problems. In fact, if you look at the overall Apollo mission report, a big thick document, probably about that thick, and one of the appendices covers anomalies for all the flights. If you ignore Apollo 7 and Apollo 8, which only had the command and service module, they did not have a landing craft, so only had one vehicle. But if you look at all the 2-vehicle flights, we had the least anomalies or problems of all the flights. Apollo 13, we had a big one, but others had a lot of things to mess with. We almost did not land Apollo 14 and Apollo 16. There were workarounds late that finally allowed them to go ahead with their descent to land on the moon. Both almost aborted. So, problems were kind of the business of the day back then. And we had a great team and a process to work the problems from on the ground.
Can you give us an idea about the environment in the limb during those 4 days that you were spending in there, and kind of like, how did you deal with sleep and eating and staying hydrated? What was the environment? How did you sustain yourself? How did you and Jim and Jack sustain yourselves?
Okay, well, the lunar module normally operating, it's a 30-volt bus main system. And normally, if it was in what you call coasting flight, not planning to land or not involved in a rendezvous, with the things you had on, you consumed about 32 amps. If you're in power descent, like to land on the moon, you're up around 60. Our situation was, when this explosion happened, we had a vehicle now to live off of, the lunar module, that was really designed and built for its mission, landing on the moon and doing two EVAs in our case, was to last roughly two days. Where we were, we now had to make this vehicle land 4 days. So that required us, if we were going to make it on power, certainly, we had to power way down. The vehicle had 6 batteries. It was battery powered, not fuel cells, like the command and service module. So we had 4 batteries in the descent stage and 2 in the ascent stage. And I had figured on very quickly, when Jim asked me about consumables, that we could go down to about 18 amps, almost just quickly looking through the systems we had to deal with. And of course, Mission Control got into it with a lot more brain power, and eventually worked us down to about 12.5 amps versus, as I said, that minimum of a little over 30 amps. So basically, the vehicle wasn't designed to operate at that lower power level with the electronics on that generated heat. And the wrapping around the spacecraft, called thermal blankets, weren't adequate. So the vehicle got chilly, very chilly down. It did not freeze anything like the command module. After we powered it down, the water tanks froze. In fact, when they recovered the capsule on board the ship, the aircraft carrier, and on the hangar deck, and inspected it, those water tanks were still found frozen after entry and the command module. So obviously it went to below 32 degrees Fahrenheit in there. I'm guessing we were in the high 30s, probably. During most of that time, it got very chilly. It also got damp because a water separator that normally operated to get rid of moisture. And I'm talking about mainly you breathe out. When you breathe out, you're breathing out moisture each time. And so water separators in both spacecraft normally took care of that. So water was built in. We could look, and the LEM had no inner walls. You could look through the netting material that was just snapped on to keep you from bumping in the wire bundles and plumbing in the LEM. You could look through and see all of that. Water was there, some of the walls, but clearly on all connector, every time it was a bend in the connector, a little glob of water had collected. And on all the connector interfaces, that kind of thing. So shimmering a little bit with the vibration of the glycol pump running and that kind of thing. So it was damp and cold. We did not have adequate clothing. I had 2 spare clean sets of underwear. So I put on all my underwear, had 3 sets of underwear. Now, people often ask, why don't we just climb in our spacesuits? Well, a spacesuit, if you went into that spacesuit without a hose hooked up to provide cooling air, you would perspire. So our situation was, I don't know if the movie got into it, I guess, or the show you just watched. We had to use 1 set of the 2 hoses in the LEM, because it was only supposed to be 2 people, tied up for that lithium cartridge fix that was done. So we're using the command module cartridge. So one there was only one set of hoses left to hook up to a suit. So Jim Lovell just made the command decision as the commander that we would all suffer equally and no one would get in a spacesuit. So we got very cold. As far as the food, one of the primary food main courses were powdered food, which if you had hot water, which available and could carefully mix it with the powdered stuff in there, it wasn't too bad really, but it really wasn't very good at all if you didn't have hot water. And only the mothership, the capsule, had hot water. The lunar module did not. So I gave up on that kind of food. I just, for 4 days, 3.5, I guess, by the time you're worried about eating, I ate out of a different opening, a hatch would open in the command module, the capsule. That was your snacks. And so I lived off peanuts, little bitty bread cubes, about that big as a picture of them. They're bite size, and the same way cookie cubes. So that was my meals for the trip home after the explosion, which is fine. You know, you can if you're in good shape, you can go without eating for a long time.
Yeah.
So at any rate, that was the food. So that wasn't too good. But I did get to feeling pretty miserable because with the cold and the chill, I somehow contracted a bug that affected my urinary tract. I had a urinary tract infection, chills and fever, and burning if I tried to urinate, that kind of thing. So that was about a day and a half before entry. So I, on top of everything else, I had that to deal with.
You're right. Can you give a kind of a description of like the size of the spacecraft? I would, assume like inside, is there, could you, for people who actually haven't seen the inside of the command module or the lunar module for that matter, how would you compare the interior space to something that someone may have experienced, like possibly a car or?
Well, to me, it's hard to picture it because it was an odd shape. You stood up. There was no couches or seats in the LEM. It was made to operate with the two people flying it to stand up. So they stood up in the front, so it had that height for two people. It did have a back area that was not as high because the ascent engine cover, the cover over the engine that would have lifted us off the moon had we landed, it protruded up into the capsule of the spacecraft. So you only had an area above that, then up to the hatch where you could go through in literally a tunnel when they were docked to get back and forth between the two spacecraft.
Yeah.
And Jack Schweigert occupied that space most of the time. He was perched on top of the ascent engine cover. Jack Schweigert, incidentally, was the command module pilot, which he knew that vehicle top and bottom, everything, and had to be it. Command module pilots had to be able to handle that vehicle all by themselves because potentially on any given mission, the crew on the moon may not get off.
Yeah.
So they had to face that possibility they'd be coming home alone. And but he knew nothing about a lunar module. He had never, in fact, until flight, when he finished powering down the command module, the capsule, when he arrived in the lunar module, where we were busily doing our thing, Jim and I, that was the first time Jack had ever been in a lunar module. He had never been in one. So that was the situation that way. In fact, when we shifted, which we did for a couple of days, either Jim or I were always on duty. If somebody went off to try to get a nap in the command module, again, just so we had at least one person who knew the lunar module. And of course, Jim and I both knew the lunar module completely because the same situation on the lunar surface, if someone had a suit failure, one person was going to have to come home alone. to get it off the moon and rendezvous and come back home. So we always had, so both people in the lunar module could operate it completely.
Another question is, did you train for manual re-entries in the simulator?
You're talking about back at Earth?
Yes.
It wasn't manual. It was done by the computer.
No, I'm talking about, so at that time, during re-entry, the command module was powered up. It was using this computer.
Yeah, it was done. In fact, that was amazing after we abused that equipment.
Right.
Electronics would powered it off, froze the command module, including the water tanks.
Right.
And brought it back to life. And it came back to life and operated perfectly. It did. Jack was prepared. Jack Schweigert was in the commander's slot at that time through entry, and was prepared to take over if he had to, but he let the computer fly it. It flew automatically all through entry.
In the video, Jim comments about a training, or at least thinking through how to fly the command and service module for being able to sight the terminator of the Earth, similar to what was done on your mission. I may have this wrong, but it sounds like during the training for Apollo 8, the thought was, what if the computer guidance system was not turned on? You didn't have the benefit of the guidance and navigation control system that the computer would provide. So being able to sight the Earth and also to take readings from the sun to be able to change your attitude and be on track. It sounded like that was actually thought through, and Jim had some level of training to kind of think that through.
I mean, yes, they had a method similar to use in Apollo 8, because that was the only vehicle they had.
Yeah.
To do a sighting on the Earth and work to get an attitude that would be acceptable for mid-courses. We, of course, had to do it differently because we're LEM, and so we did it with the Jim looking out the front window at the COAS, which is like a gun sight, sighting on the Earth, pitching up very slowly. I was looking through the AOT, the Apollo Optical Telescope, in the lunar module, where the upward field of view in that was about 60 degrees up. So when I saw the sun barely come into the view, I told Jim to stop the pitch rate, which he did, and that was the attitude. So in a similar way, they had devised some mechanical way to do it with just the capsule, but we were using a totally different system in the LEM.
I learned that in the film, Ron decided to make that burn 39 seconds rather than the 14 and a half that actually occurred. just to be able to kind of lengthen that scene to create a little bit more drama.
The exaggerated, out of control look like scene. Yeah. Right.
Right. In that case, when you were recovered, when you boarded the USS Iwo Jima, did you have like any particular food cravings? I mean, were you I know that's probably what you weren't thinking necessarily about, like what your next meal was going to be after sustaining yourself on snack foods for 3.5 days. But did you happen to have any particular cravings at that particular moment or soon after recovery?
No, when I got on board and after we got through the meeting, the captain or whatever, I went to sick bay.
Yeah.
I had chills and fever.
Right.
So I wasn't interested in eating. Jim and Jack went to a celebration they had set up on the hangar deck. It's where the airplanes are below the landing deck, and had set it up to have cake and ice cream, I guess, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
For a celebration of the thing getting us back. So they got some food. I don't know if I wasn't with them, so I don't know if they got a regular meal as well. I'm telling you, no, a human being, not average, you and I right now, even though I'm 91 years old, I'm sure I could go 2 weeks without eating, nothing. Now, water is different. You can't do without water a couple of days, 3 days max.
Yeah.
And if I was in good shape like I was back then, I could probably go 3 weeks without eating. So I don't think eating is a problem. Never was.
Right.
Yeah.
If I think we have a couple more minutes. If someone has a last minute question, Karina, if you want to come off mute and ask a question, feel free to do so. I would invite others to do the same if someone has a follow-up question they would like to ask Fred.
I was thinking, hello, Fred, by the way. I was
Hello.
thinking along the lines of what you just asked, Logan. What were you most excited to return to when you got back to Earth?
What was most exciting?
Most excited to, what made you the most grateful to be back on Earth? What were you the most grateful that you were going to be able to see or do or experience again?
Well, other than surviving, the next thing was to find out the news that the mission had been accepted the way it had, that it was a great success in the sense of the teamwork and the recovery, the actions to get us back. Because in the back of our minds, at least my mind, was a concern this is a failure. We were supposed to, the third mission to land on the moon. We did not land. There's a lot of money involved in making one of these launches. And I was concerned we may affect the program's survival of the Apollo program. That it was a bad thing that had happened. So I was more, until I got the news, wow, I said, this is great that at least those have many people, including the population, has taken it in the right way, that we didn't flunk, that we managed to get back. And so it did not mean the end of the program. And that's kind of in the back of my mind.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions from the participants? And by the way, we have 13 participants.
That same light, I might move on briefly to what we're not planning to discuss, but I had a similar feeling about that when I flew Enterprise. When I flew the approach and landing test with the very first space shuttle orbiter, we had an 8-flight test program. I commanded 5 of the 8 test flights we did, where we flew it off the back of a 747. That could get us up to about 30,000 feet to do these tests at Edwards Air Force Base. And the reason is we only had, first of all, one Enterprise. We had a backup vehicle for the test program, but we canceled it for funds because funding, what we were underfunded with the shuttle program in the early few years. And so if something had happened, that would have been really bad in terms of schedule effect. And NASA themselves, early in that year, had reflected that the thermal tile problem on Columbia, the second vehicle that was to go to orbit, having problems and was going to cause up to a 2-year delay in the first orbital launch. So that negative news was out there. And at the same time, January, we had, just as we just recently did here, recent times, we had changed presidents. President Jimmy Carter had come in. There had never been any discussion in the debates about space. It just wasn't a hot item in anything that came up in the debates that had been held. So we did not have a good reading on what President Carter felt about this program that had been started by President Nixon. And there's always a concern when the program started by one president and a new one comes in. Will they continue to support it? So that was big in my mind when I first launched off of the carrier the first time, that nothing went wrong that would damage Enterprise or be a really failure. Because again, same way there, that might have ended the shuttle program before it ever got underway. That was in my mind that day.
And we know the happy ending to that story. Well, it looks like we're at the end. I will just point out that we actually have 13 participants. So, this number just keeps showing
Yeah,
up.
I can't see faces, but I can see all the names up there.
Yeah. Let me see if
I
I
see
can.
I see one name, Conrad. Is that person any kin to the Conrad family? As in Pete Conrad, Apollo 12?
Mm.
Feel free to come off mute.
Oh, it looks like we had one more question pop up. If we have a couple minutes, if you don't mind, Fred.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
It says back then, would you have imagined space exploration would be farther along by now in 2025?
Well, space exploration, in some areas has gone on. We've done a lot of work on Mars, had these rovers that one of them still running around. But as far as going back, like the moon or going to Mars, of course, that has not had much fruition. And with respect to Apollo kind of program. So it's been dragging on. Artemis, which is for the first time carried people to loop around the moon, has now been had just recently been curtailed to another year, to 2026, I think. Whereas originally it was going to fly, I think, in 2025, 24 rather, and then went to 2025. So that has, and again, it's a matter of it has not been funded. People don't realize that, but NASA does not have a big pot of gold sitting around. They depend on congressional funding each year to whatever progress they can make on whatever plans they may have for either unmanned or manned activity. And if you don't get funded, it'll tend to slip and drag on. And actually, when you finish with any kind of program and look at the total cost, it generally will have costed more than it would have had you funded it properly to some program plan and got the flying done earlier. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation there. We've of course had great success with commercial ventures. SpaceX in particular has a remarkable launch rate with their Dragon, and it just launched again, even with this bad weather. I think launched again. It's put up a Starlight system. I know people who are using it, and it's worked very well. But they've supported NASA with the space station, getting people up and down with their capsule, and they've also had a number of commercial launches, commercial satellites, as well as even the Defense Department. So they've got a booster that's working pretty well. The second venture has just had one launch. That's finally that's off the road, and it actually can carry a little more gross weight than the SpaceX booster. So anyway, some of the commercial ventures have been sprung up and been highly successful, and can offer some cost savings in how they're being utilized by NASA.
Yeah. Well, Fred, thank you for a wonderful evening. Karina, who is our host at the North Olympic Library System and director of the Adult Education Services, thank you very much for
okay. And just
us.
So everybody knows, I'm in an office in Houston. Houston, very unusually, we've had a snowfall the last 2 days ago. It put about 2 to 4 inches on the ground. Some still out in the backyard right now. It's kind of melted off about halfway. I'm in my office. The pictures you see on the wall are not space pictures. I don't have many space pictures in my office. That's family. And that's why I'm in Houston. I have 2 daughters who live here. I have 6 grandchildren. I have 2 great grandchildren, and a third one's on the way. I'll be here in a couple of months. So that's why I'm in Houston. I have family here, and at my age, I'm 91. And just with my pet, I lost my wife back this coming February. Will be 3 years. Pat's been gone. So it's just me and my pet Tito, and my home here in Houston. So it's good to have family all around.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And this year we celebrate the 55th anniversary of Apollo 13.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
April 11th.
55 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you to both of you, Fred and Logan, for being with us tonight. I feel like we could go on and on and on. But thank you so much. And thanks to
All
everyone
right.
for joining us.
All right. It's happy to join y'all. Good luck to everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Fred. Thanks, Logan.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good
Bye
night,
now.
everyone.